In this video, I'll show you how I created the meat-like object that is used in the carnivore canine and molar simulations. Both use the same nParticle meat object, but are manipulated by two different passive collider teeth. This wedge-shaped passive collider, which represents a carnivore molar, cuts through the nParticle meat, and the cone-shaped passive collider, which represents a carnivore canine, pierces into the nParticle meat. Here's an outline of the steps we'll take to set up this simulation. Model a polygon mesh in the shape of the meat. Fill the mesh with particles and hide or delete the original mesh. Turn on the nucleus ground plane so that the particles have something to interact with. Edit the particle settings so that they behave like a thick liquid. Glue the nParticles together with a component-to-component constraint to mimic a solid yet reactive piece of meat. Decrease the glue strength so that the component-to-component constraint can be cut by a passive collider. Cut the nParticle meat with an n-rigid tooth-shaped collider. Finally, when all of the properties of the simulation are adjusted the way you want them, convert the nParticles into a polygon mesh. Let's get started. The first thing we need to do is create a polygon mesh in the meat shape that we want. We'll then fill the polygon object with nParticles so that we have a group of nParticles in the shape of our meat object. I've already modeled the polygon object and have it here in this Maya file. To fill the polygon object with nParticles, click on the object in the viewport, make sure that we have the nDynamics menu set selected, and click nParticles, Create nParticles. Let's change the particles to the ball preset if it isn't already selected, so the particles will be easier to see. Next, click nParticles, Create nParticles, Fill Object, Options. Turn close packing off and change the resolution to 60. The higher the resolution, the better the simulation. But a higher resolution will also create more particles, so it will take longer to calculate the simulation. Click Particle Fill to fill the object with particles. Now, let's hide the mesh so we can see the nParticles. Click on the mesh to select it, and click Command H on the keyboard to hide it. Finally, let's change the color of the particles so they're less distracting. Click on the particles in the viewport, and in the Attribute Editor, under the Particle Shape 1 tab, click to twirl down the Shading tab. Let's delete the second color and change all of the particles to a light tan color. If you play the simulation now, the particles will just fall infinitely under gravity. Let's turn on the ground plane in the nucleus solver so the particles will have something to interact with. Click on Nucleus 1 in the outliner, and in the Attribute Editor, under the Ground Plane tab, click Use Plane. The ground plane will show up in the viewport. Right now it's in the center of the nParticle object, so let's move it down to just below the bottommost nParticles. I'll also increase the ground plane friction just a little to 0.3, so the nParticle object sticks a bit to the ground plane instead of sliding too fast along it. Now, when you play the simulation, the nParticles will drop, but will be stopped by the ground plane. This looks like a solid piece, but let's take a look at what happens when it interacts with a tooth object. Let's unhide the tooth from before by clicking on it in the outliner and clicking Shift-H on the keyboard. As you can see, when we scrub through the timeline, it's already animated to cut into the nParticle object. But if we play the simulation now, nothing will happen because I haven't added it as a collider to the nParticle system. To make the tooth into a passive collider, select it in the viewport and choose nMesh, Create Passive Collider. Now, when we rewind and play the simulation, you'll see the tooth interacting with the nParticles. The nParticles aren't acting how we want them to, though. They're just falling apart and spilling out the sides. We want the particles to look like a piece of raw meat when we interact with them, so we want them to act like one solid object that is still a bit soft and flexible, almost like a very thick jello. In the next video, I'll show you how to edit the particle system so that it looks like a solid, raw meat-like object.